It was one of those crisp evenings when the air outside carried a soft chill, and the city lights glowed like tiny golden stars scattered across the streets. Inside the grand concert hall, hundreds of people had gathered, dressed in their finest clothes, waiting eagerly for the famous pianist to appear. The air buzzed with excitement, laughter, and whispers of admiration. Some were longtime fans, while others had come simply to witness the legend perform live. The pianist, known all over the world for his brilliance and playful nature, stood behind the curtain, peeking at the crowd. He had performed in countless places, Paris, Tokyo, New York, but tonight felt different. He wanted this evening to be remembered, not just for his music, but for something fun, something unexpected. He had always loved humor, and his shows often included light moments to keep the audience smiling. As he looked out at the crowd, an idea suddenly came to him, a small prank, something harmless that would bring laughter before the serious performance began. He smiled to himself. Why not ask someone from the audience to play the piano? He thought. It'll be a good laugh. People will love it. He imagined the gentle chaos it would create, the nervous laughter, the person fumbling with keys, and the audience cheering in amusement. The lights dimmed slightly, signaling that the performance was about to begin. The pianist walked onto the stage, greeted by a thunder of applause that filled the entire hall. He bowed gracefully, smiled at the cheering faces, and sat by the piano. After playing a short, cheerful tune, he looked up and addressed the audience with his usual charm. "You've all come here to listen to me play," he said, his voice warm and teasing. "But I was thinking, what if someone from this wonderful crowd takes a turn first?" The audience burst into laughter and claps. Some shouted jokingly, "Not me," while others pointed at their friends. The pianist chuckled, enjoying the energy in the room. He walked closer to the edge of the stage, scanning the faces in the crowd. His eyes wandered from one row to another until they stopped at a woman sitting quietly in the middle section. She wasn't dressed like most others. While many wore fancy clothes, she wore something plain but neat, a simple light-colored sweater and dark skirt. Her hands were folded in her lap and she looked calm, almost invisible among the glittering audience. Something about her stillness caught his attention. Maybe it was her calmness in all that noise. With a mischievous grin, he pointed toward her. "You, madam," he said gently, "how about you? Would you honor us with a few notes?" The crowd clapped and laughed again, some cheering for her to go. The woman looked startled, her eyes wide. She placed a hand on her chest as if to say, "Me?" But the pianist nodded with a friendly smile. The lights above the audience shifted, spotlighting her gently. There was no escape now. After a moment of hesitation, she stood up. Her movements were shy, her steps small as she walked toward the stage. The audience watched curiously, expecting a funny moment. Some whispered to one another, amused at her nervousness. The pianist helped her up the small steps leading to the piano. "Don't worry," he said kindly, though still playing along with the joke. "Just a few notes. Anything you like." The woman smiled awkwardly, brushing her hair behind her ear. She didn't say much, only a soft, "Okay." She sat down at the grand piano, her back slightly hunched, hands resting gently on her lap. The huge piano looked intimidating beside her, its polished surface shining under the stage lights. For a second, she just sat there in silence, staring at the keys as if trying to remember something. The pianist stood beside her, arms crossed, still smiling for the audience. "Go ahead," he whispered. "The stage is yours." The audience chuckled quietly, expecting a few random notes and maybe some laughter. But what happened next silenced everyone. The woman lifted her hands and placed her fingers on the keys. Her posture changed, not dramatically but enough to notice. Her shoulders relaxed, her head tilted slightly forward, and her fingers hovered above the piano with a strange confidence. The pianist's smile faded slowly as he watched her. There was something different in her presence now, something focused, almost sacred. Then came the first note. It was soft, so soft that it felt like a whisper. But it carried through the hall like the start of a story. Then came another note and another. The sound was pure, smooth, and filled with emotion. The laughter that had filled the room a minute ago disappeared completely. The audience went silent. Even the pianist stopped breathing for a moment. Her hands began to move faster, not clumsily but gracefully. The melody started to take shape, weaving emotion through every note. It wasn't loud or showy, it was gentle, heartfelt, and hauntingly beautiful. The pianist stepped back slowly, unsure what to do. The prank had turned into something completely unexpected. As she played, the audience began to lean forward in their seats. Her music felt like it was telling a story, something deep and personal. The sound of her fingers moving across the piano filled every corner of the room. Some people closed their eyes, feeling the emotion flow through the melody. Others watched her intently, mesmerized by her quiet passion. The woman didn't look up once. Her eyes stayed fixed on the keys, and her fingers moved with a rhythm that seemed natural, as if the piano was a part of her. The melody rose and fell like waves, sometimes gentle, sometimes heavy with emotion. Each note seemed to come from her heart rather than her hands. The pianist stood at the side of the stage, his expression softening. He had spent years mastering his craft, performing for kings, presidents, and millions of fans. But in that moment, he felt like a student watching a teacher. He could sense pain in her music, but also peace. Whatever she was playing wasn't just a song. It was a memory, a story without words. Minutes passed, but it didn't feel like time was moving. The audience was completely silent, no one daring to even cough or whisper. The melody wrapped everyone in its warmth, and for that brief time, it felt like the world outside didn't exist. When she finally played the last note, her hands stayed on the keys for a few seconds longer, trembling slightly. The sound lingered in the air, fading slowly into silence. For a long moment, no one moved. Then someone began to clap softly, followed by another, and soon the entire hall erupted into applause. It wasn't the usual polite applause. It was loud, emotional, and full of awe. Some people stood, tears in their eyes. The woman looked up, her face calm but emotional. She smiled faintly, her eyes glistening. The pianist walked toward her, speechless at first. He took her hand gently and helped her stand. "That was unbelievable," he whispered. The woman nodded, still quiet, and looked out at the standing crowd. The applause continued, echoing through the hall like thunder. The pianist raised her hand high, as if introducing a great performer to the world. He could see the confusion and wonder on people's faces. They all wanted to know who she was. How could a random woman from the audience play like that? After the applause finally softened, the pianist turned to her again and asked softly, "You've played before, haven't you?" She smiled a little sadly but didn't answer. Instead, she looked down at the piano and ran her fingers gently along the edge of the keys, as if saying goodbye to something dear. Then she looked back at him and said quietly, "It's been a long time." There was something in her voice that made his heart tighten, a kind of quiet grief mixed with peace. Before he could ask more, she turned toward the audience, gave a small bow, and walked off the stage. The crowd clapped once again, giving her the kind of respect usually reserved for legends. The pianist stood there, watching her disappear into the dim light of the aisle. He felt a strange mix of humility and wonder. He had planned a harmless joke to make people laugh, but instead, he had witnessed something far deeper. That melody had touched not only the audience, but also him. As the lights dimmed for intermission, the crowd buzzed with whispers. Everyone was talking about her, the mysterious woman whose music had made them cry without understanding why. Some said her playing reminded them of lost love, others said it felt like hope. No one could quite describe it, but all agreed it was unforgettable. The pianist went backstage and sat quietly for a moment, still lost in thought. The prank had turned into a performance that would stay in his memory forever. He realized that music, no matter how famous or perfect, is truly powerful only when it comes from the heart. That night, before he went back on stage for his main performance, he looked out toward the audience again. He could no longer see the woman. She had slipped out quietly, leaving only the echo of her melody behind. He sat at the piano, closed his eyes, and played, not for applause, not for fame, but with the same raw emotion she had shown him. The audience could feel the difference. They could feel that something had changed in him. And even though no one knew the woman's name, her music had become part of the night, a gentle reminder that sometimes the most powerful stories come from the most unexpected people. And for the pianist, that evening would always remain one of the most beautiful lessons of his life. The moment the woman stepped off the stage, the crowd kept clapping, as if no one wanted that magic to end. People whispered among themselves, some smiling through tears, others still frozen in disbelief. The pianist remained near the piano, quietly watching her walk down the aisle and disappear. Through the side exit, the lights dimmed, but he couldn't move for a few seconds. His prank had changed the whole atmosphere of the concert. What started as a light joke had turned into something almost spiritual. When the applause finally faded, the pianist took a deep breath and looked at the grand piano again. The same instrument that had always obeyed him now felt different, like it held a secret. He touched the keys lightly, almost afraid to disturb the silence she had left behind. Then, regaining his focus, he turned toward the audience with a humble smile. "Well," he said softly, "that was unexpected." The crowd laughed gently, but it wasn't the same laughter from before. This time it carried respect, warmth, and emotion. He continued, "I think she just reminded all of us what music truly is. It's not about fame or skill. It's about feeling." He smiled again and added, "Now, if I can play half as honestly as she did, tonight will be worth remembering." The audience applauded once more, and he began his performance. But as his fingers moved across the keys, something felt different inside him. His usual precision and speed were still there, but his heart felt heavier. He could still hear her melody in his mind, every note filled with emotion. For the first time in years, he wasn't just playing to impress. He was playing to connect. Backstage, after the performance ended, the crew and event organizers were still talking about her. Some thought she was a professional pianist pretending to be a random audience member. Others wondered if the whole thing had been planned. But the pianist knew the truth. He had never seen her before, never expected anything like that. It wasn't an act. It was pure, honest emotion that had touched everyone in the room. Later that night, after the crowd left and the hall became quiet, the pianist stayed behind. The workers were cleaning up, folding chairs, and turning off lights, but he sat near the piano, lost in thought. He couldn't stop thinking about her face and the calm expression, the trembling hands before she started playing, and the peace that came over her once she began. He replayed the moment in his head, how her fingers had moved so effortlessly, how her melody carried sadness and beauty at the same time. It didn't feel like performance, and it felt like confession. Every note seemed to tell a story of love, pain, and forgiveness. He wondered what kind of life she must have lived to play like that. For someone to express that much emotion through music, there had to be a story behind it, something deep, something human. He looked around, hoping she might still be there, maybe backstage or near the exit, but she was gone. It was as if she had appeared just to remind everyone of something important and then vanished quietly. He sighed, closed the piano lid gently, and whispered to himself, "Who are you?" The next morning, newspapers and online pages were already filled with the story. "A random woman brings a concert hall to tears," the headlines read. Clips from the night went viral across social media. Short videos showing her sitting nervously at the piano, the audience laughing, and then the moment she began to play. Comments poured in from all over the world. People were moved by her performance, even those who hadn't been there. She played like someone who had lived through everything. That melody felt like a part of my life. Music from the soul, not from the stage. The pianist read some of the comments and smiled sadly. He wished he could find her, thank her, talk to her, ask her where that melody came from. But there was no name, no clue, no way to reach her. No one seemed to know who she was. Days passed, but the memory stayed fresh in his mind. He went back to practicing, preparing for his next tour, but something inside him had changed. His fingers still played the same notes, but his heart wasn't in the same place anymore. He had realized how easily music could lose its soul when it became only about perfection. That woman had reminded him of what it truly meant, to play with feeling, not just with skill. 1 week later, he was walking through a small cafe near the same concert hall when he heard a faint tune playing softly from an old radio. It was the same melody she had played that night. His steps froze. He turned to the waiter and asked, "Where is that coming from?" The waiter smiled. "Someone uploaded the recording from your concert," he said. "It's everywhere now. People are calling it the melody of memory." The pianist smiled, though his eyes softened with emotion. "The melody of memory," he repeated quietly. The name fit perfectly. He sat down at a corner table and listened to it again, this time not as a performer but as a listener. The melody sounded even more powerful than he remembered. Each rise and fall seemed to carry hidden words, like the music itself was speaking. He closed his eyes and felt a lump in his throat. For a moment, the world around him faded. When the song ended, he opened his eyes and realized something. Maybe it wasn't about finding her. Maybe it was about carrying her message forward. Maybe her purpose that night was to remind him and everyone else what real music was. That evening, he sat by his piano at home and tried to recall her melody. At first, he struggled to remember every note, but slowly it came back to him. He played it softly, his fingers trembling slightly as the sound filled his quiet room. It felt like he was reconnecting with something sacred. The melody made him think about his own journey, how he had started playing as a child, full of wonder and passion, but somewhere along the way, fame and schedules had taken that innocence away. Her music had awakened that childlike part of him again. He played late into the night, blending her melody with his own style, letting his emotions flow freely for the first time in years. When he stopped, he sat there in silence, his hands resting on the keys. For the first time in a long time, he didn't feel tired or pressured. He felt alive. A few days later, during an interview, the host asked him about the incident. "That performance went viral," the interviewer said. "Was it planned?" The pianist smiled softly. "No," he replied. "That was the most real thing that's ever happened on my stage." The interviewer leaned forward. "Who was she?" He shook his head. "I don't know. But whoever she was, she reminded me that music isn't something we play for others. It's something we play to heal ourselves." After that, fans began asking him to perform the same melody at his shows. But he refused. "It's not mine," he said each time. "It belongs to her." Still, he sometimes included a short version of it in his concerts as a quiet tribute. Whenever he played those few notes, the hall would go silent. People could feel it, that same warmth, that same ache, as if the spirit of that night still lingered in the music. Months went by. The fame of that mysterious performance didn't fade. Music schools discussed it, radio stations played it, and people online continued to share it. Some tried to find her identity, but no one succeeded. It was as if she had never existed, except for that one moment on stage. One evening, after another concert, the pianist was leaving through the back door when an elderly man approached him with a small envelope. "Sir," the man said politely, "a woman asked me to give this to you. She said you'd understand." The pianist took the envelope, his heart pounding. Who was she? Where did she go? The man shook his head. "She left right after the show. Didn't say her name." With trembling hands, he opened the envelope. Inside was a small handwritten note that said, "Thank you for letting me remember." The melody was for him. The one I lost, the one I'll always love. Music was the only way I could speak again. Please don't forget what it made you feel that night. Below the note was a pressed white flower, fragile but beautiful. The pianist stood there for a long moment, holding the note, feeling tears gather in his eyes. He didn't need to know more. Her message was enough. He went home that night and placed the note on top of his piano. Every time he played, he glanced at it as if she were still there, reminding him to play from the heart. From that day on, his performances changed completely. People said his music felt deeper, more emotional. He stopped chasing perfection and started playing with honesty. Every time he sat at the piano, he thought of that night. The night a simple woman had taught a world-famous musician the true meaning of art. And somewhere out there, perhaps in a small apartment or a quiet little town, the woman might have smiled, hearing the echoes of her melody reaching the world again, not through her hands this time, but through the heart she had awakened. The night after receiving that mysterious letter, the pianist couldn't sleep. The words written in that soft, delicate handwriting kept echoing in his mind. "Thank you for letting me remember." The melody was for him. He read the note again and again, every sentence pulling him deeper into curiosity and emotion. He wanted to know more about her story, who him was, what she had gone through, and how that melody was born from her pain. But deep down, he also felt that maybe it wasn't his place to ask. Maybe the beauty of that night came from not knowing everything. Still, he couldn't let it go. He sat at his piano and began to play that same melody again, as he had done many times since that evening. But this time he tried to feel what she might have felt. Each note carried a piece of sorrow and warmth. The melody rose and fell like someone speaking gently about love and loss. He closed his eyes and let the music take him somewhere else. For a moment, it didn't feel like he was playing. It felt like she was speaking through his hands. As days went by, people continued to talk about the mystery woman. Journalists wrote about her, music teachers analyzed her style, and fans posted messages online trying to find out who she was. Does anyone know her name? They asked. She must have been a professional pianist once. But no one had any answer. She had simply disappeared into the crowd, leaving behind only her music and that note. The pianist decided to keep her story alive. During interviews, when people asked about his greatest memory on stage, he always mentioned her. That night changed everything for me, he would say. It reminded me that music is more than performance, it's emotion. It's what makes us human. His words touched people everywhere, and soon, that one moment became a symbol of hope for many musicians who had lost their passion. Months passed, and his concert tour took him to different countries. Yet no matter where he went, audiences would ask him about the woman. Will she ever come back? Someone asked during a live event. The pianist smiled gently and replied, maybe she already has. In every person who feels something when they hear that melody. During one quiet afternoon between concerts, the pianist visited a small town near the mountains where he had been invited to rest for a few days. The town was peaceful, filled with narrow streets, little cafes, and flower shops that smelled of roses and rain. He walked aimlessly, enjoying the quiet after months of crowds and applause. But something strange happened as he turned a corner. From one of the small cafes came a familiar sound, a piano. The melody was faint, but the first few notes were unmistakable. It was her melody. He stopped walking, his heart suddenly racing. Could it be her? Slowly, he followed the sound, pushing open the cafe's wooden door. Inside, a few people sat sipping coffee, and in one corner stood an old upright piano. A woman sat there, her back to him, playing softly. She looked older than he remembered, her hair tied back, her shoulders slightly bent. But the way she played, the emotion in her touch, the calm in her movements, there was no doubt. It was her. He stood near the doorway, not wanting to disturb her. She was lost in her music, her eyes closed, her fingers moving gently across the keys. The room was filled with that same quiet magic, the same unspoken sadness mixed with peace. Even the people in the cafe seemed to sense it. No one spoke, no one moved. They just listened. When she finished, a few people clapped softly. The pianist stepped forward slowly, his heart pounding. When she turned around and saw him, her eyes widened in surprise, then softened into a small, knowing smile. I didn't think I'd ever see you again, she said quietly. He smiled back, almost speechless. Neither did I, he replied. I didn't even know how to find you, she laughed gently. I didn't want to be found. That night was enough for me. He looked at the piano, then back at her. You left a note for me, he said. It meant more than you can imagine, she nodded. I hoped it would. For a few moments, they both stood in silence, the sound of soft chatter and cups clinking in the background. He wanted to ask her so many questions about her life, about him, about the music, but he didn't know where to start. So instead, he asked the simplest question. Who taught you to play? She looked down at her hands resting on the keys. My husband, she said softly. He was a musician too. We used to play together almost every evening. Music was our way of talking when words weren't enough. Her voice trembled slightly, and the pianist could see the emotion in her eyes. She took a deep breath before continuing. A few years ago, I lost him in an accident. After that, I couldn't bring myself to play anymore. Every time I touched the piano, it hurt too much. It reminded me of what I'd lost. He listened quietly, not wanting to interrupt. She smiled faintly. That night at your concert, when you called me up, I was terrified. I hadn't touched a piano in years. But when I sat there and looked at those keys under the lights, something happened. I remembered how he used to smile whenever we played. I remembered how alive we felt. It was like he was standing beside me again. So I played for him. The pianist's eyes softened. That's why it felt so real, he said quietly. Everyone in that hall could feel what you felt. She gave a small nod. Maybe that's what music does. It carries the parts of us we thought we lost. He smiled gently, his heart full. You changed me that night, he said honestly. I thought I knew what it meant to play from the heart, but I didn't. You reminded me. The woman's eyes glistened with emotion. Then I'm glad. Maybe that's what I was meant to do. Just to remind someone. They both sat down at the piano, side by side, and for a few seconds neither spoke. The cafe had grown quiet again, as if waiting. The pianist looked at her and said softly, Will you play it again with me this time? She hesitated, then smiled. All right, Together they began to play. The sound that filled the room was breathtaking. His powerful, precise style blended perfectly with her gentle, emotional touch. The melody transformed, richer and deeper, as if two stories were being told at once. His journey and hers, strength and vulnerability dancing together. People in the cafe stopped eating, stopped talking. Some closed their eyes. Others held their breath. It felt like time had stopped again, just like that night in the concert hall. When they finished, there was silence before the room erupted in applause. But for the two of them, the applause didn't matter. They just looked at each other and smiled quietly, both understanding something unspoken. After the performance, they sat for a while sharing tea. She told him more about her husband, how they had met in a small music school, how he used to write melodies for her, how they had dreamed of performing together one day but never got the chance. Every word carried love and every pause carried pain. He listened carefully, not as a celebrity but as a friend. He realized how much strength it must have taken for her to play that night in front of a crowd, to open her heart again after years of silence. "You've turned your pain into something beautiful," he said softly. She smiled. "Music helped me survive it. I think that's what it's for. It's not just for applause, it's for healing." The pianist nodded. "You're right. I think sometimes the world forgets that." They parted that evening with warmth and gratitude. She thanked him for giving her the courage to play again, and he thanked her for giving him back his purpose. Before leaving, she said something that stayed with him forever. "Keep playing with your heart," she told him, "because someday someone out there will need your music the same way I needed mine." He watched her walk away, her figure disappearing down the quiet street as the last bit of sunlight faded behind the mountains. For a long time he stood there feeling a strange mixture of sadness and peace. He knew he might never see her again, but he didn't need to. Her words, her story, and her melody had become a part of him. When he returned to his hotel that night, he sat at the piano again. This time he didn't just play her melody, he played theirs, the version they had shared together. It was full of emotion, full of life, full of everything that made music more than sound. And as the notes echoed through the room, he realized something profound. The most beautiful melodies are not written. They are felt. They come from the quiet corners of our hearts, from the pain we've endured and the love we've lost. And when shared, they have the power to heal not just the listener, but the player too. That night, as he finished the last note and let it fade into silence, he whispered to himself, "Thank you, for the melody, for the reminder, for the truth." And somewhere in that small town, maybe the woman heard the same tune carried softly through the night air and smiled, knowing her music had finally found its way home. That evening, after the concert had ended and the hall slowly emptied, the famous pianist stayed back near the stage, still lost in thought. The lights were dim now, and the soft hum of people talking in the lobby faded into silence. His heart was still heavy with something he couldn't quite explain. The performance had been a success. The audience had loved it. The reviews would likely be glowing. But his mind kept returning to that single, unexpected moment when the woman played. Her tune, simple yet powerful, had touched something deep inside him. He found himself sitting alone at the piano again, tracing the keys with his fingertips. The smooth surface felt different now, not just a tool for performance, but something alive. He began to play, softly at first, echoing the melody the woman had played earlier that day. It wasn't perfect. He didn't even know the full tune, but something about it lingered in his mind. Every note she had touched carried emotion, sadness, love, pain, and beauty all at once. It reminded him of why he had started playing music in the first place. As he played, his assistant entered quietly from the side door. "You're still here," she said softly, almost surprised. "Everyone's gone." He nodded, his fingers still on the piano. "Do you remember that woman earlier? The one I asked to play as a prank?" She smiled faintly. "Of course. How could anyone forget? That melody. I've never heard anything like it." He looked up, his eyes thoughtful. "Neither have I. It wasn't just music. It was a story. You could feel it." The assistant hesitated. "Do you think she was trained?" He shook his head slowly. "No, her technique was raw. Her fingers trembled at times. But what she played, that came from the heart. You can't learn that from a book or teacher." The assistant nodded. "She said she used to play when she was young, didn't she?" He leaned back, thinking. Yes, I want to find out more about her. I don't even know her name. The assistant looked curious. Why? He gave a half smile. Because I think her story is hidden in that melody. And maybe it's worth hearing. The next morning he woke up earlier than usual. He couldn't get the memory of that melody out of his head. He made himself a cup of tea, sat by the window and stared at the sunlight spilling across the city rooftops. For years his life had been routine, concerts, travel, interviews, applause. But now he felt something stirring inside him, a quiet curiosity, maybe even longing. He decided to visit the small community hall where the woman had been working that day. It was a modest place, peeling paint on the walls, posters for local events, and children's laughter echoing from the next room. He walked in, trying not to draw attention, though his face was known to many. The manager, an older man with kind eyes, greeted him. "You're the pianist from yesterday's concert, aren't you?" He nodded politely. "Yes. I wanted to ask about one of your staff, the woman who helped with the arrangements yesterday." The manager smiled knowingly. "Ah, you mean the one who played that tune, yes? Everyone's been talking about it." "It was quite something." "Yes," the pianist said softly. "Do you know her name?" The manager paused. "Her name is Lena. She's been volunteering here for a few months. Keeps mostly to herself. Comes in the mornings to help with the kids' music classes." "Does she teach?" the pianist asked, surprised. "Not exactly," the man replied. "She just helps tune the instruments, sometimes plays for the children. They love her. But I think she's been through a lot. You can feel it when she plays." The pianist nodded slowly. That made sense. He thanked the manager and left, walking down the street with a strange feeling in his chest. He didn't know why he cared so much. Maybe it was because her music reminded him of a time before fame, before expectations. A time when music was pure, simple, and honest. Later that week, he saw her again by chance. She was sitting outside the same hall, tying her hair back, surrounded by children holding small instruments. They were laughing as she corrected their hand positions. He approached quietly, not wanting to interrupt, but one of the children noticed him and gasped. "It's you, the piano man!" The children ran to him, excited. She looked up, startled at first, then smiled shyly. "You came back," he nodded, smiling warmly. "I wanted to hear you play again." She hesitated, looking unsure. "Oh, I don't really perform. That was just beautiful," he interrupted gently. "And I mean it." She blushed slightly, glancing at the children who were watching curiously. "They're my audience now," she said softly. "They don't mind if I miss a few notes," he chuckled. "That's the best kind of audience. Honest and forgiving." One of the kids tugged his sleeve. "Can you both play something together?" The pianist and Lena exchanged a surprised look, then laughed. "All right," he said, "but only if she agrees." The children cheered, and Lena reluctantly sat down at the old upright piano in the corner of the hall. It was slightly out of tune, some keys stuck, but it had charm. The pianist sat beside her. For a moment there was silence. Then, together, they began to play. He started with a gentle classical theme, and she joined in softly, weaving her melody between his notes. The two styles blended, his precise and polished, hers warm and emotional. The hall filled with a sound so pure that even the children fell silent. The sunlight streamed through the dusty windows, catching the movement of their hands. When they finished, the room erupted in applause. Small hands clapping, laughter ringing. Lena smiled, her eyes bright. "That was unexpected," she said. He grinned. "That's what makes it real." After the children left, they stayed back, still seated at the piano. He turned to her. "That melody you played at the concert, I can't stop thinking about it. Where did it come from?" Her smile faded a little. She looked down at her hands. "It's an old tune," she said quietly. "My mother used to play it. When I was young, she said it meant hope, that even when life becomes silent, a single melody can bring light." He listened, his chest tightening. "That's beautiful," she nodded. "I stopped playing for a long time after she passed away. Then one day I sat down again and it just came back to me, every note, like she was there." He didn't speak for a moment. Then he said softly, "You know, music like that doesn't just come from skill, it comes from life." She looked up at him, surprised by the gentleness in his tone. For someone known for his confidence and stage presence, he suddenly seemed very human. Humble, even. They talked for a long time that day. She told him about her childhood, about how her mother had taught her to listen to the sound of rain as if it were a song. He shared stories of his own, of endless tours, of the loneliness behind the fame, of how he sometimes felt like he had lost touch with the meaning of music. By the time they stepped outside, the sky was turning pink with sunset. The streetlights flickered on one by one. He turned to her and said, "I'm performing again next week in the city hall. Would you come?" She laughed lightly. "As an audience member?" He smiled. "No, as my guest. Maybe even as my duet partner." She looked startled. "Oh no, I can't." "Yes, you can," he said kindly. "You have something that people need to hear. Not for fame, just for feeling." She hesitated for a long moment, then nodded slowly. "All right," she said softly. "But only if we play that melody again." He smiled. "Deal." That evening, as he returned home, something felt different. For the first time in years, he wasn't thinking about reviews, critics, or schedules. He was thinking about the music itself, and the way her melody had changed everything. Days passed quickly after that. They met several times to practice, though it never really felt like practice. Sometimes they played, sometimes they just talked. About life, about loss, about finding purpose again. She told him that for her, music wasn't about perfection. It was about connection. He realized how much he had forgotten that truth. One afternoon, during a rehearsal, he stopped playing midway and looked at her. "Do you know what's strange?" he said. "When I play alone, I hear sound. But when we play together, I hear meaning." She smiled, her eyes glistening. "Maybe that's what music is supposed to be." He nodded. "Maybe." The night before the performance, they both stood inside the empty hall looking at the grand piano on stage. The same stage where they had first met. She walked over, running her fingers across the polished surface. "I never thought I'd be standing here again," she said softly. He joined her. "Life has a strange way of bringing people back to where they belong." She looked up at him, nervous but smiling. "Do you think people will like it?" He shook his head gently. "It's not about them liking it. It's about them feeling it. And they will." That night he couldn't sleep. He kept thinking of how everything had started. Just a simple prank meant to make people laugh. But now it had turned into something much deeper. A connection, a rediscovery, a story told through music. When the morning light came, he knew this performance would be different from all the others. It wasn't just another concert. It was a moment of truth for both of them. That morning the city was calm but filled with the quiet energy of anticipation. Posters of the famous pianist's upcoming concert were everywhere, in cafes, on street corners, and even outside the small community hall where Lena usually spent her mornings. The air carried that mixture of excitement and nerves that always came before something special. But this concert was different from all the others. This one had heart behind it. The pianist stood near the tall windows of his hotel room, staring down at the crowd already forming outside the concert hall below. Reporters were setting up their cameras, people were waiting in line, and yet his thoughts were somewhere else entirely. He wasn't thinking about fame or applause. He was thinking about a single melody that had changed his understanding of music. He turned toward the piano in his room and sat down. His hands rested on the keys for a long moment before he began to play softly. It was Lena's melody again, gentle, haunting, and honest. Every time he played it, something inside him felt lighter, as if it reminded him of who he truly was beneath the layers of success and expectation. He closed his eyes and remembered her smile during rehearsals, the way her hands trembled slightly when she played. Not out of fear, but emotion. She didn't play to impress anyone. She played to express something words couldn't say. That was the kind of truth he wanted the world to feel tonight. Later that afternoon, the hall started to fill. Musicians tuned their instruments backstage. The audience murmured with excitement, and the stage lights glowed softly above the grand piano. Lena arrived quietly through the side entrance, holding her old sheet music in her hands. She wore a simple dress, not glamorous or flashy, but graceful in its simplicity. Her eyes held a mix of nervousness and wonder. When she saw the pianist waiting near the piano, she smiled faintly. "It feels unreal," she whispered. He smiled back. "That's because real things often do," she laughed softly. "I still can't believe I'm here. A few weeks ago I was helping children tune violins, and now," he looked at her with gentle seriousness, "now you're about to remind people what music really means." They sat together for a quiet moment, letting the stillness settle. From behind the curtain, they could hear the buzz of the audience, the rustle of programs, and the sound of someone testing the microphone. The pianist took a deep breath. "Whatever happens out there," he said softly, "just play like you did that day. Play from your heart. That's all that matters." She nodded. "I will." When the announcement echoed through the hall, "Please welcome our performers for tonight," the audience erupted in applause. The pianist stepped out first, bowing politely, his calm presence filling the room. Then, to everyone's surprise, a woman followed him. Quiet, humble, holding no sheet music, only a faint smile. The crowd looked puzzled for a moment, whispering among themselves. Who was she? Why was she here? He turned toward the microphone and spoke briefly. "Before we begin," he said, "I'd like to share something. Sometimes music doesn't come from fame or years of practice. Sometimes it comes from life itself, from memories, loss, and love. Tonight, I'm honored to share the stage with someone whose music reminded me of that truth." The room fell silent. The audience looked at the woman beside him, curiosity in their eyes. She sat down at the piano first. Her hands hovered above the keys, trembling slightly. Then she began to play. The same melody that had first captured everyone's hearts in that rehearsal hall filled the air again. Soft, fragile, yet incredibly powerful. The notes seemed to float above the crowd, wrapping around them like warmth on a cold night. The pianist joined her after a few measures, his sound blending with hers, polished and controlled, yet guided by her emotion. It was a duet between experience and feeling, between precision and soul. Every note told a story, of loss, of rediscovery, of two people who found meaning in music once again. As they played, something remarkable happened. The audience stopped shifting in their seats, stopped whispering. They were still, completely drawn into the sound. The melody built slowly, reaching places words couldn't. It wasn't just a performance. It was a conversation, a reminder that behind every piece of music there's a heart trying to speak. When the final note lingered in the air, silence filled the hall, a deep, emotional silence. Then came the applause. It started softly, then grew louder until the whole room was standing. The applause echoed, but Lena didn't seem to notice. Her eyes glistened with tears. She looked at the pianist, who smiled at her warmly. "You did it," he whispered. She shook her head, smiling through her tears. "No, we did." After the concert, people gathered around them backstage, showering them with praise. Some were crying, others speechless. The pianist answered a few questions politely, but his focus remained on her. She seemed overwhelmed, not by fame but by emotion. Later, after everyone had left, the two of them sat on the stage. The lights dimmed. The hall was quiet again. She looked around, her voice soft. "It's strange. The same place that felt so big a few weeks ago now feels peaceful," he nodded. "Because it's not about the place. It's about what you leave behind," she smiled. "Do you think they felt it?" He looked at her with gentle certainty. "I know they did." For a long while they sat in silence, just listening to the faint echoes of music that seemed to still linger in the air. Then she spoke again, almost hesitantly. "You know, when you asked me to play that day, I thought it was a joke. I almost said no," he chuckled. "It was meant to be a joke. But maybe the best things in life start that way." She laughed softly. "Maybe," he leaned forward slightly. "What are you going to do now?" She thought for a moment. "I don't know. I'll still go back to the hall. The kids need someone to help them with their lessons. But maybe I'll play more. Not for people. For myself." He nodded approvingly. "That's the best reason to play." As the lights dimmed completely, they both stood up. He reached out and shook her hand gently. "Thank you," he said sincerely. She smiled. "For what?" "For reminding me why I started all this," he said. "For reminding me that music isn't just sound, like it's feeling." Her smile deepened. "You didn't forget. You just needed someone to remind you." He laughed softly. "I suppose I did." The next morning, news of the performance spread everywhere. Headlines praised the concert not just for its perfection, but for its soul. "The night music found its heart again," one paper wrote. Another headline called it a performance that transcended technique. It spoke directly to the heart. People wanted to know who the woman was, where she came from, what her story was. But she didn't seek interviews or attention. She simply returned to her quiet life, teaching music to children and helping tune instruments at the community hall. Still, every now and then she would receive letters from people who had attended the concert. Strangers thanking her for reminding them that beauty can come from simplicity. The pianist, meanwhile, continued to perform around the world, but his concerts were never the same again. He stopped chasing perfection and started focusing on connection. He often included Lena's melody in his shows, always mentioning it as a song that changed everything. And every time he played it, the audience felt something beyond admiration. They felt understanding. One day, months later, he returned to the same small hall where it had all begun. He wanted to see her again, to thank her once more. When he arrived, he found her sitting at the piano with a group of children, laughing as they tried to play a few simple notes. She looked up and smiled when she saw him. "You're back," she said, her eyes warm. He smiled. "I had to visit the place where I learned to listen again." The children gathered around excitedly. "Play something!" they shouted. He looked at her. "Shall we?" She nodded, laughing. "All right, but only if they sing along." They began to play. Nothing grand, just a cheerful tune that made the children giggle and clap their hands. It was pure joy, the kind that only comes from music shared without ego. When the children left, the two of them stayed behind for a while. The sunlight streamed through the dusty windows the same way it had weeks before. He turned to her and said quietly, "You know, that melody of yours has traveled further than either of us imagined. People everywhere are listening to it." She smiled, a hint of disbelief in her eyes. "It's not really mine anymore, is it?" He shook his head. "No, it belongs to everyone who needs it." For a long time, neither spoke. Then she said softly, "I used to think I'd lost everything when I stopped playing, but now I realize I hadn't lost it. It was just waiting for the right moment to return." He looked at her, his eyes thoughtful, and it did. That evening, as he walked away from the small hall, he could still hear faint notes drifting from the piano. Her melody again, simple and full of feeling. It echoed through the streets, through the hearts of people passing by. Some stopped to listen without even knowing why, and for him it was enough. He didn't need to search for meaning anymore. He had already found it, in one unexpected moment, one unplanned tune, and one woman who reminded him that music is not about perfection, but about truth. The melody that began as a prank had become something far greater, a story told through sound, one that would live in every note he played from that day forward. It wasn't just her melody now. It was their story, a quiet testament to how sometimes the simplest moments can touch the deepest parts of the human heart. Weeks turned into months, and the story of that night continued to ripple quietly through people's hearts. The world had seen countless concerts before, but this one had left a mark. It wasn't just because of the music. It was because of the feeling behind it, a rare kind of honesty that reminded everyone of what truly mattered. The pianist had returned to his usual tours, traveling from city to city, performing on the grandest stages. But something inside him had changed. He no longer chased perfection or applause. His performances were no longer about impressing. They were about connecting. He noticed how different everything felt now. The way his fingers touched the keys, the way the audience listened, and even the way silence filled the hall after his last note. There was a new depth, a softness, something more human in his playing. He often began his shows with a short introduction, telling the audience about the melody that changed his life. He didn't use names or long stories, just a simple truth. "Once," he would say, "someone reminded me that the most powerful music comes from the heart, not the hands." And then he would play that same melody, the one Lena had played on that day that started as a prank. Every time he played it, the hall would grow silent. Some people would close their eyes, some would tear up, and others would simply smile. It wasn't a complicated tune. In fact, it was one of the simplest pieces he'd ever performed, but it carried a kind of peace, a reminder that beauty doesn't need to shout. Lena, meanwhile, stayed in her small town. She continued to work at the community hall, teaching music to children and organizing small performances for the local families. She didn't crave the spotlight, nor did she want to be famous. What she wanted was to make people feel something, the same way she once had when she sat beside her mother at the piano as a child. The children adored her. They would gather around her every morning, eager to play, their laughter filling the hall. Sometimes she would tell them stories about the world of music, not from textbooks, but from the heart. Music isn't about being perfect, she would tell them. It's about telling your story in sound. One day, as she was finishing a lesson, one of the children handed her a small letter. "It's for you," he said shyly. She opened it, her eyes softening as she read the neat handwriting. It was from the pianist. "I'll be back in town next week for a small charity concert. I'd like you to come. It won't be grand, but it will be real, just like that day. And if you're willing, I'd love for us to play together again." She smiled as she folded the letter. It had been months since they had performed together, but she still remembered every moment of that night, the sound of the applause, the warmth in his eyes, the way the music had spoken without words. When the evening of the concert arrived, she dressed simply again, the same way she always did. She didn't bring sheet music or makeup or anything fancy, just her hands and her heart. The concert was held in a modest venue, smaller than the one before. The audience was made up of ordinary people, students, families, and locals who had come to listen, not to judge. The pianist greeted her backstage with that same warm smile. "I was hoping you'd come," he said softly. She smiled. "I almost didn't," she admitted. "I was nervous." He laughed gently. "So was I, the first time we met." They shared a quiet laugh, the kind that came from understanding. Then he said, "This time I want you to start. I'll follow your lead." She nodded, taking a deep breath as they walked out onto the stage together. When the lights dimmed and the hall fell silent, she sat at the piano and began to play. The melody flowed like water, calm, unhurried, full of feeling. It was the same tune, but this time it carried something more. There was peace in it now, not just sorrow. It spoke of healing, of acceptance, of life moving forward. When he joined in, his notes blended with hers effortlessly as if the two had been written for each other. The audience sat completely still, holding their breath. The sound rose and fell like a conversation between two souls, one sharing pain, the other offering comfort. By the end, there wasn't a single dry eye in the room. The applause that followed was gentle at first, then stronger, but still filled with respect. People didn't cheer wildly. They simply stood, feeling grateful to have witnessed something so pure. After the concert, they walked outside together. The night air was cool, and the city lights shimmered in the distance. She looked up at the sky and said softly, "It feels different this time." He nodded, because it wasn't just music anymore, it was closure. She smiled. "You think so?" He looked at her kindly. "I know so. You found your peace, and you helped me find mine." They walked in silence for a while, the only sound being their footsteps and the faint hum of the city. Finally, she said, "Do you ever miss the life before? The rush, the crowds, the noise?" He thought for a moment, then shook his head. "No. I used to think I needed all that to feel alive. But now I realize that the most meaningful moments are quiet ones, the kind you can't plan." She nodded. "Like the prank you played on me." He chuckled. "Exactly." They both laughed, and for a moment, it felt as though time had stopped. The noise of the world faded away, leaving only the memory of the melody that had brought them together. A few weeks later, she received another letter. Not from him this time, but from a music foundation. They wanted to fund music programs in small towns, inspired by the story of the famous pianist and the woman whose song had touched millions. They had heard about her work with the children and wanted her to lead one of the programs. She was surprised. It wasn't fame she had ever sought, but the chance to help others through music. That was something she couldn't turn down. She accepted the offer, and soon her small hall was filled with new instruments, fresh paint on the walls, and even more laughter than before. The pianist visited when he could. Sometimes he would surprise the children by joining their lessons, sitting beside Lena at the piano and playing a simple duet. The children loved watching them play together, not because they were famous, but because the music between them felt so real. Years passed, But the bond between them never faded. They didn't need to speak often. Their connection lived in the melody they had shared. It had become something timeless, passed from them to others, played by students in classrooms, by strangers online, by orchestras who felt its power. The melody had taken on a life of its own, and whenever someone asked the pianist about it, he always said the same thing. That song came from a heart that had seen both pain and beauty. It wasn't mine alone. It belongs to everyone who listens. As for Lena, she continued to teach until her hands began to tremble with age. Even then, she would sit at the piano each morning, touching the keys gently, playing a few soft notes. Sometimes she would smile to herself, remembering the moment it all began. A random request, a small prank that had led to something far greater. One evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon and the hall grew quiet, she sat at the piano once more. Her students had gone home. The instruments were neatly arranged, and the air was filled with that familiar stillness. She played the melody again, slowly, tenderly, as if saying goodbye. The sound drifted out through the open windows, reaching the street where a passerby stopped to listen. He didn't know who was playing, but something about it made him pause. It was peaceful, gentle, full of life. At that very same time, far away, the pianist was on stage in another city. He had just finished a grand piece, and the audience was waiting for an encore. He sat in silence for a moment, then smiled softly and began to play the melody. Though they were miles apart, their notes seemed to meet somewhere in between, two hearts speaking the same language, as they always had. When he finished, he looked up at the audience and said quietly, "That was for a friend, the one who reminded me that music can heal." The applause that followed wasn't loud, but it was full of love. In the months that followed, stories began to spread about the woman who had inspired a melody that touched millions, and the pianist who carried it across the world. But for them, the story wasn't about fame or recognition. It was about rediscovery, of music, of connection, of humanity itself. And somewhere in a small hall filled with laughter and dusty sunlight, the melody continued to live on, played by young hands who didn't know the full story, but could still feel its meaning. It was a reminder that sometimes life's most powerful moments come from the most unexpected places. A simple tune, a shared silence, a connection that outlived everything else. That was how the melody began. As a prank, a coincidence, and how it became something eternal, carried not by fame, but by feeling. And even as time passed and the world moved on, whenever that melody was played, it still had the same effect it did on the first day. It brought people to tears, not because it was sad, but because it was true.